Athletes, take your mark and get set. It's time for the Addict to Athlete podcast. Hey everybody out there, Coach Blu Robinson here. Thank you all for downloading, sharing, and subscribing to the podcast. Totally appreciate it. And even more so, if you wouldn't mind jumping on and leaving us a review, it helps us get this podcast out further to those who struggle with mental health, addictions, any kind of roadblock you might find in life. Addict to Athlete is here to help. I want to give you all a special thanks and shout out for joining us through September's Recovery Month. And now, applying those same principles for Sober October. I think that this community that we are able to establish through health and wellness, recreation, and being able to erase the addiction by replacing it with things of greater value is catching on. And I know that because our numbers are increasing. We get a lot more communication through you, the listeners, about things that you want to hear, and I totally appreciate you guys doing so. Jump on any social media platforms. You'll find us all there. We're talking Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, shoot, even TikTok. We are all over the place. So please jump on, reach out, communicate with us. You will talk to, and more often than not, connect with us, the individuals behind the scenes here at Team Addict to Athlete. Again, turn your attention to our website, addicttoathlete.org. We've got a ton of community resources. We've got our old podcasts archived there. We've got blogs and resources, all kinds of stuff to assist you through your recovery journey. And it doesn't have to be for just you specifically if you're struggling with addiction. We have produced this program to assist anyone struggling. Even if you have a loved one and you yourself do not have an addiction, our resources page will do phenomenal work for you to learn more about addiction, how you can help, and how you can avoid some of the pitfalls that kind of plague some family members and loved ones who try and really invest in the individual to try to help without having the knowledge or know-how. Check out addicttoathlete.org. It would be silly if I didn't have you while you're on that website. Check out our online store. You can find all of our team gear, our official racing gear, shoot, even our extracurricular recovery line of clothing. We've got stuff for anyone who finds any kind of pleasure in sports, recreation, health, and wellness. There for you. Go advocate. All proceeds go to our 501c3 chapter to help us increase our reach and to help turn the mess of addiction into the message of recovery. And I want to give a special shout out and thanks to our Patreon subscribers. Our Patreon subscribers are helping us so immensely get this podcast out further. They are really the backbone of our team here. They help provide funding for this podcast so we can do more with it, get it out there further, and it's showing. And if you want to join the Patreon, family, jump on patreon.com/addict, T-O-athlete, and pick a tier that's going to work for you. Each tier comes with specific perks and bonuses, from free merchandise to all kinds of extra bonus materials that are going to come out. We do bonus episodes of the Extracurricular Recovery Playbook, sometimes 2-3 times a week. So jump on there and check it out. This is your online resource for your treatment and recovery. You jump on there and you download and listen to the podcast that we're putting on there specifically for the Patreon subscribers. And we have a week by week, sometimes multiple times of content that you can truly begin your healing process in your recovery from drugs, alcohol, or any issue that you feel like you want to overcome. So jump on there. It's patreon.com/addicttoathlete. Let's give a special shout out and thanks to our super fans. They are Jerem Thurston. Thank you so much, Jerem. Holly Davies, Scott Foster, Coach Chris Williams, Brett Frew, Coach Tara Butson out there in Telluride, Colorado. Thanks, Coach. Steve Riggs, Chelsea Olson, and the Warrior Within podcast and personal development by Sensei KP. If you guys haven't checked out KP's podcast, do so. There's a lot of similarity. There's a lot of connection. And this is something that I think is interesting. Great minds think alike. KP does that as well. Our rookie level subscribers. We've got Kenny Roseman and Earl Dyer, two men that are so dear to my heart. Thank you, Kenny and Earl. You guys are rock stars. Our pro level subscribers, Gary Thurston and Josh Hansen. Thank you guys so much. And of course, our championship level subscribers, the top tier. They are Shad and Freya Robinson and the Robinson family, Ron and Dee Loesch, and Tracy Whitby. I'm telling you guys, they are fantastic sponsors and supporters of Team Addict to Athlete. And if you haven't been able to come down and participate in a running event with Shad and Freya and the Robinson crew and Push Emma, please contact me. You're going to want to do that. We're going to be having our new 2021-2022 shirts out for the Patreon. So stay tuned for that because we got a new logo, and you guys who will qualify for that will be getting that shortly. So athletes, I want to jump in today and talk about something that was a spin-off from our last conversation. I wasn't planning on doing a solo podcast again, but because of some of the, response that we got from the dual diagnosis podcast, I wanted to drop a little bit more information on a tool and some tools that can be used not only to identify whether or not those attributes are affecting you, but really some of the secrets of overcoming addiction. Because I'm a firm believer that we are not just in recovery, that we can actually heal from this. And that's very controversial, so let me repeat that. Athletes, we can heal from addiction, not just stay in active recovery. I hear this a lot, and it's been kind of an interesting, subject when I go to like a conference or a meeting and someone speaks and they always begin their lecture with, "Hello, my name is so-and-so, and I'm in long-term recovery." Now, let's talk about the difference between recovery and healing from addiction. So the term recovery, let's jump into it. Simply defined, recovery is the act, process, or instance of recovering, which does make some sense, right? But it's also the process of combating a disorder such as alcoholism, drug addiction, or real or perceived problem, which is kind of interesting. The act of, which means it's the process of, which means that if you're in active recovery, if you're in long-term recovery, you will always be in that process, that there is no hope that you can actually heal from this. Now, I beg to differ. And 10 years ago, let's say like 15 years ago, you know what, no, scratch that. When I first started doing this 20-something years ago, I started realizing that if I taught individuals that they would forever and always be in recovery, what kind of life would that lead? What if instead of that mindset of we are always going to be in recovery and we can't heal from that? What if we started leaning towards the getting to the core of the issue, the problem that caused the whole situation in the first place? And what if we found it, discovered it, identified it, felt from it, learned from it, and then eliminated it? Then what could we do? Would we be able to move from recovery to actually healing? Now, the word healing is kind of an interesting concept as well. I want you to hear the difference. You know what recovery is now. Healing is defined as to make free from injury or disease, to make sound or whole, to make well again, to restore to health. And now listen to this part, okay? To cause an undesirable condition to be overcome, to patch up or to correct a breach or division. Now, I don't know about you, but when I hear the difference between healing and recovery, I'm going with healing every time. And I know it's not a sexy word to use, and I know that because of the potential relapse and because of what the community at large has kind of indoctrinated us all with, using the term healing and I've healed from addiction rather than I'm in recovery means that there's a potential that what happens if you slip? What happens if you relapse? Well, then you're re-injured, right? It doesn't mean that it's a continuation from the same aspect, issues, or consequences that you had when you were in active addiction. You guys, if we are in the mindset that we can never heal, I want you to look at it in terms of this. Let's say that when you're in high school, you're out there playing football for the guys, right? You're out there playing football and maybe you get a wacky tackle and you break your arm. You're 17 years old, your arm gets broken, you get to the hospital, they put a cast on it, and then it heals up, and then maybe say, 15, 20 years down the line, you're in the backyard with your son and you're reliving them glory days, like Uncle Rico on Napoleon. And you're like, go along, son. And the son's like, Dad, throw it to me. And you get thinking, you know what? I don't think I can throw this ball, son. Because back in high school days, my glory days, I got tackled and broke my arm and I'm still in recovery. Well, Dad, how could you be in recovery? Your arm seems to be working fine. Yeah, I know, it does. It still works fine, but it's in active recovery, long-term recovery. You guys, that doesn't make any sense. It's silly, right? Because if you break a bone, let's say even a compound fracture, the spot where that bone gets reset and heals is actually going to heal stronger. And yes, you're always going to remember the fact that it broke, that it hurt, but that point of break is going to grow back stronger. Now, yes, obviously, it's going to take time. You're going to have to go through some rehab. You're going to have to get some strength training. But what say you limit your actions and your whole life because one time you had a broken bone and now you're in active recovery, so you can never be at peak physical condition again? No, you can heal from those kind of things. So if you're telling me if the brain is broken, like a lot of people want us to believe, and I think that there's some aspects where that's true, but if it's a disease and we heal the brain, guess what you don't need anymore? Lots of expensive therapy, lots of expensive inpatient treatment, lots of outpatient time investments, all these things. And it doesn't become real sexy then, and you don't get to identify yourself as an addict anymore. You get to identify yourself as a human being and as a father and as a son and as a brother and as a scholar and as whatever you choose, right? But if I'm in a constant state of recovery, well, then I'm subjected to a relapse back into treatment, a relapse back into therapy, a relapse back into the rooms. Guys, gals out there, I don't know if this approach that we've been using is very effective. And the reason why is because the recidivism rate, meaning the time that you go through a program, get out and go back, is extremely high. And I see it a lot in my community here in Utah where I'll have a client that will go into treatment. They'll come out, they'll go to treatment again, they'll get out, they'll go back to treatment again. And it just keeps going through and through. It's a recidivism rate. And then they start going to different programs and they start bouncing around. And pretty soon we're bouncing clients to and from different programs. And then not to mention the fact that once we get done with programs, they get to go to this awesome little thing called sober living. Sober living, I think, needs a complete overhaul, and this could be a whole nother podcast because I'm noticing that when you are in sober living and you're still in addiction because we've kind of treated maybe the symptoms and not really the root cause of addiction, what I find is that when you start getting a little freedom back and then someone has a slip or a relapse, guess what happens when you're in sober living? You get kicked out. And you get kicked out at probably one of the worst times of life because you are being kicked out coming off of an addiction, coming off of a relapse. And what are you going to do 9 times out of 10? You're going to go back out there and use again, and you may not make it back that time. So I understand why sober livings kick people out because they use. But should we be doing stuff like that? That seems to me like a Neanderthal kind of mindset, that at their worst, when they have no more support, when they have more freedom, they have access to the therapy and all this stuff through outpatient, that we kick them out into the wilderness, so to speak, into the city again, and we expect them to be clean. And then when you have 4 days clean, you can come back. That doesn't make any sense. It's the easy thing to do because problem solved. You jeopardize this whole house. Guess what? You get kicked out. What if we went a different way, though? What if we went, instead of that recovery route, we went the healing route? Instead of kicking that person out for exhibiting behaviors that are associated with their addiction, how about these sober living programs actually have these funny little things called therapists? And not just house managers, who are typically the people who are in treatment as well, that have some long-term recovery. And we kind of crown these house managers with all this responsibility and the stewardship when they don't have the proper training. Sure, they go out there and they get maybe their mentor degree or their what have you, but realistically, they are still early in their recovery as well. But they have people in sober living, they have less access to professionals and more access to people who are on their level. And when they screw up and exhibit behaviors and symptoms associated with their disease of addiction, if you want to call it that, we kick them out. Now, I don't know how that's legal. It's very strange because that's like almost signing a death certificate. So the system's broken. We get that. But what happens if we start looking at this through the eyes of healing instead of recovery? Well, then you're not going to need all those resources. Then we're going to get to the core issue of what's driving your addiction in the first place. I noticed really early in my career that I was treating symptoms of addiction and not the core issue of addiction. Okay, now listen to that. Treating the symptoms of addiction, not the core issue of addiction. So what does that mean? It's like this. You have a cold. And we know you have a cold because you have the symptoms of a cold, right? You got some fatigue. You've got the stuffy, runny nose. You've got the sneezes. Maybe you've got the cough. We know you have a cold. Well, I guess in this day and age, you might have COVID, right? But for the sake of this, you've got a cold. But I guess within the last couple of years, that might also mean you've got COVID. But for the sake of my little, story here, let's pretend like you've just got a cold, okay? No nasal swabs needed. But treating the symptoms of the cold means you go down to Walgreens or to your pharmaceutical aisle at Walmart and you pick up a cold and flu medication, right? It takes away the sniffles, it takes away the cough, it takes away the sneezes, and it takes away the symptoms of the cold. What it doesn't do is cure the cold, right? I don't know if there is a cure for the cold still, but it takes away the symptoms. That means if the symptoms are gone, do you still have a cold? Yeah, you do. But we can't tell because you're not coughing, you're not sneezing, maybe you're not as fatigued, but you still have the cold. So let's talk about this. Substance use. Using a substance is a symptom of something deeper. So most treatment programs, most of the stuff that I've worked for, they go in and we try to suppress, eliminate, alleviate the symptoms, right? We try to alleviate the drug use. We try to alleviate the consequences that come from that. We try to alleviate the sad stuff and replace it with the good stuff. We take away the negative reinforcers that you use and try to replace them with positive reinforcers. And over time, guess what happens? We effectively eliminate the symptoms. But guess what's left behind? More often than not, treatment solves the symptoms. Very rarely do they go for the cause. And the reason why they don't go for the cause is, I'll let you in on a little secret, we don't have enough time with you. And the reason why we don't have enough time with you is because of the insurance and all the other crazy hoops you have to jump through. Or maybe it's the person going in's not ready yet. But nonetheless, we heal the symptoms. We very rarely go for the cause. Now, years ago, and I'm talking years ago, I discovered kind of a method that I like to use to go for what's called the core issue. This is that part where we go in and identify what in the world created this addiction in the first place. And what I learned is that instead of just trying to convince people to be clean through healthy behaviors and through eliminating the symptoms, what if we went in and did the heavy lifting? What if we went in and did the sensitive work? What if we went in and really drilled down on what caused this? I'm a firm believer that we can do this. And I know this because I've worked with it with hundreds and hundreds of clients. And guess what they've done? They've found their core issue. They've identified what it was. They've differentiated how they feel about it versus how they think about it. We're going to get into that. They've decide and figure out what they want for themselves, for the others and the stakeholders in their lives, and then they come up with a plan to eliminate that core issue. And that plan to eliminate that core issue isn't just a one-liner like, well, I guess we'll just do it one day at a time. No, that's just an awesome slogan that rhymes and kind of rolls off the tongue really sweet. This is an active plan, something you're going to physically do to eliminate that core issue, and you're going to pick a day to do it. When's the now? In order to overcome addiction, you cannot just go to meetings and therapy and overcome it. You have to actively pursue it. You have to be active, get your hands, so to speak, in the dirt of life. You've got to maybe sweat a little bit, get some sweat equity in there. You've got to maybe have some tears and maybe be vulnerable. You can't just go to a meeting or to a therapy session, talk about roses and lilies and how everything sucks and how everything's stacked up against you and how the world owes you a living. No, you've got to physically and actively be actively engaged in your recovery process to create and promote healing. Now, I'm talking some heavy stuff here because, again, 10 years ago when I started becoming more of a public, person and started, spewing some of these ideas, man, it did not sit well with people because, again, if we heal you, you no longer need us. It's the same way I've been doing EMDR with my clients and my athletes. If I can train you in the art of doing it for yourself while you're out running, walking, recreating, what have you, you're not going to need us anymore. Maybe you'll come back and check in when you hit something that's a little bit more challenging, but guess what? We're giving you the tools, and that's what this is going to be. It's going to be giving you the tools in order to do this. So without getting too in-depth in it, because it's kind of a personal thing to each of you, you need you to understand why it's important to understand what your core issue is. Now, I've noticed some patterns in addiction, okay? Been doing this a really, really long time, and I've noticed that there's usually 9 times out of 10 an activating event. Now, here's the deal. Before we get into that, maybe I'm going to rewind just one little step and tell you about what my philosophy is on addiction, okay? My philosophy on addiction has been and always will be that there are two classes of it. The first one is, why do people use? Well, the first one is to just experience it, to see what it is, maybe to put your toe in that water of life and to see how hot or how cold it truly is. These are people that go in, they have the experience, maybe they drink a little bit, maybe they smoke a little pot, a little bit of weed, and you know what happens? Well, maybe they like it, but maybe they realize, not for me, and they move on. These are the people that can go in and get prescription medications for a tooth that was pulled, use 2 or 3 of them, and then get rid of the rest. These are the people that go in and maybe drink to have maybe just a little bit of edge taken off, but you know what? They know when to say when. Those people are very interesting to me because I wasn't one of those persons, and probably you listeners aren't as well. So it brings us to the other side, the larger population. I'm going to call you the 9 times out of 10 people. 9 times out of 10, what I've noticed is that we use out of curiosity, but it fits the void that we're trying to suppress, meaning we use it to cover some kind of pain. Now, what does that mean? Physical, more than that. Physical pain is a great thing to get rid of, obviously, but it also takes away emotional, spiritual, mental, relationship, all kinds of pain. It doesn't have to just be physical. It could be so many different varieties and attributes that you don't even realize how large maybe that scope is on the umbrella by which you used under. We use to cover some kind of pain. Something hurt, something sucked, something was unpleasant, something was scary, something was traumatic. About 2 years later, after an activating event, on average, sometimes more, sometimes less, but on average, a 2-year window, we discover our drug of choice. That drug of choice typically is chosen for a very specific reason. It fills the void, it covers the pain, and we are off to the races until the one day we discover that we've been lied to, that although it may suppress the pain, it also makes things very, very, very difficult and much, much worse. So let's check into this, okay? It's interesting. I find that most people begin using between the ages of 12 to 18. Majority of you and me start using about that time. So let's just say someone starts drinking about age 14, okay? You go back 2 years, okay? So you go back to age 12. And I like to do this. I like to say on average, I go back and I find out what was going on in life at age 12. And they'll tell me, Blu, life was great. Things were awesome. It was a great family and all this. The only thing I can think of is that we moved from Southern California to Utah. And I'm like, dude, how easy was that? You went from a place where you were planting some roots and being able to establish yourself, then you're uprooted and moved to Utah. And although it was mandatory, guess what happened? You had to change everything about you. You had to shift not just friends, but cultures and schools and all kinds of things. Or they'll say, well, you know what? My life was great. My dad took me hunting. We did all these things. But then you start boiling it down and you're like, yeah, but I kind of rebelled a lot. My mom and dad weren't on the same page. Didn't really talk to us much. You guys, there's always something. And it doesn't have to be tremendous trauma. I remember talking to so many people who come to a group and they're like, well, I don't feel like I fit in because my trauma isn't as intense as somebody else's. As we're sitting in group and we're getting to know new people and they're coming in talking about maybe severe child abuse and whatnot. Yeah, I have another guy who's sitting across from me whose maybe worst thing that happened to him was being mocked because he spelled a word wrong in the school spelling bee. Guess what? When you compare your trauma that way, you're setting yourself up for failure because it doesn't matter what mechanism, what degree, how long, who it was, stuff hurts. And it hurts us all the same way. It doesn't matter to what severity or what degree. If it hurts, it hurts. Your brain doesn't differentiate, the pain from neglect, from the pain from abandonment, from the pain of physical abuse to all that. Guess what? It's all the same. Pain is pain. So no one can really hang their hat on, well, I have a horrific story of child abuse. Well, if someone has that and someone has something that's a lot lighter, does that mean that you reign supreme for some weird kind of game you're playing? No. What it means is that we hurt and we typically find the substance that fills that void. And it works quite well until it doesn't anymore. So if we find the core issue there within that, and your substance of choice tells me an awful lot about you, it really does. I look at this and I think, all right, alcohol and weed smokers, you guys are the ones that are self-medicating depression. I've seen it time in and time out. You're not that hard to figure out. Folks that are using opiates, you really got hurt. Something really stings. mental, emotional, physical, spiritual, something hurts. It really does, right? Those of you guys who are using things like benzodiazepines, opiates, stuff like that, like benzos and anti-anxiety medications, you don't want to feel good. You don't want to feel bad. These are they who are really deep in the trauma, right? The really heavy stuff. Folks that use methamphetamines, speeds, stuff like that, like amphetamines, the bigger, badder, faster, stronger guys, sometimes you're the ones that just need to be able to invest and try to do more, be more, want more, and you think that it's going to work, and it does for a certain point, but your substance of choice tells me an awful lot about you. And so we're not that unique when we boil it down, your reasonings for using, but it does help me understand what path we need to take. Now, that's a long story short, but the reason why I wanted to deep dive into some of this is because it's like, all right, then, once we identify our core issue and we start figuring out what it is, then what do we do with it? Well, once you identify what your core issue is, and it's associated and related to things that happened that created your addiction, we start going through this process of discovering it. And trust me, when we do this the first time with you, if we don't identify what your core issue is, if we think we're close, but we don't quite nail it, we won't be able to finish this process. We'll get stuck along the way. But after hearing your story and kind of understanding where you come from, we label and we identify what you believe your core issue is. And for the sake of time, I'll let you know that mine was neglect. Okay, neglect is an awful core issue to have because neglect kind of represents the fact that there's people in my life that I thought could love me and take care of me and support me and be there to nurture and do all those things that would happen, but they never did. And so although I knew the capacity of these people in my life were there and they could do it, they just never did. And so my thoughts turned into feelings. Now here's the hardest part. Once you identify what your core issue is, you have to distinguish your thoughts from your feelings. And let me tell you, listeners, it is a lot more difficult identifying what you think about your core issue than what you feel about your core issue. We're going to take a little side path here. We live in a world where people do not like to discuss their thoughts because now in 2021, if you post your thoughts on something, you will get attacked and you will get brutally beaten for whatever you believe in. If you're an anti-vaxxer, if you're a pro-masker, if you're a pro-vaxxer, or an anti-masker, it doesn't matter what side you fit on. If you put your thoughts out there, you will be attacked 100% from some Trump supporter or from some Biden supporter. We all have these opinions that we think everyone else should share. And so we get on these little soapboxes and these high horses. And if you put a thought out there, Lord have mercy, you're going to be attacked. So we've come up with a little, I think, nuance, this little like sidebar in and of itself of, if I mask my thoughts as feelings, people can't debate me. You can't debate my feelings. These are mine. It's my truth, right? So if I say, I think that, anti-vaxxers are a bunch of goofballs, right? They don't believe in science. We're going to have a debate. But if I say, I feel that anti-vaxxers are goofballs, you can't debate my feeling. That's my feeling, right? You can't. I'm like, oh, is this how I feel? No, sorry for you. Or if I say, I think that, pro-vaxxers are nutballs because, they don't know what's in that injection. Well, we're going to have a debate. But if you feel it, you guys, you can't argue that. The problem is now we've screwed that up royally. We've screwed it up to the point now where we use feelings so loosely instead of thoughts that we're losing track of what's really going on. So we need to stop and really check our process here. The reason why we start with thoughts is because after identifying that core issue, it is your thoughts that create your feelings. So what are my thoughts on neglect? What are my thoughts about neglect? When I do this with my clients, it's so easy for them to slip into that paradigm of feeling. It's hard to identify thoughts. So a thought on my own core issue of abandonment when I was going through this process was, I truly thought I was the problem. I truly thought no one could love me. I thought that I was a waste of everyone else's time. I thought that neglect meant that I was going to be all alone. I thought that neglect meant I couldn't ask for help from anyone. All these thoughts that I had created feelings of sadness, of stress, of anger, just deep depression, all kinds of feelings. But it was my thoughts that created those feelings. And so you go through this process, and once you identify what you want for myself as it pertains to neglect, what I want for others as it pertains to neglect, and what I want for my stakeholders in life as it pertains to neglect, I'm able to come up with my action plan on what it was. And my action plan, as I went through this, was pretty amazing, and it was hard, and it was scary, and it changed my life forever. But when I stopped being neglected was the day I took an action step to show the people that were neglecting me that I was still very much a person, that I deserved love, that I deserved to be cared for, that I wasn't going to remain silent anymore, that I was willing to sacrifice a relationship that didn't exist to step out of that darkness into the light. And that meant sacrificing, again, the relationship that didn't exist with my mother. And I had to write a letter to her, the person who neglected me and my needs the most. And it was rough. It was hard, you guys. It wasn't easy. And it was so difficult. I look back at it now, and when I talk about this, it's almost unfathomable, because these are things that I sometimes ask of you. That if you're willing to go the whole distance and truly heal from this, you cannot be in a constant state of recovery by hoping that the same things that you use to get yourself into addiction and the people, places, and things that helped you along the way are going to be there for you when you're in your recovery. You have to teach them and show them that that old way is not the new way. And if they're not willing to change and they're not willing to bring you in for who you're becoming, then guess what? You will constantly be in that statute of recovery, never healing. So, long story short, I wrote a letter to my mother because as I tried to do it on the phone, she hung up on me. It was 7 years after I sent that letter, and I knew she read it, obviously, 7 years later, that she reached back out. And it never has, I think, achieved the level of relationship that I would like to have, but it's a relationship that her and I need. Now, that's my journey, my story. That was what my action plan was, to eliminate that neglect as a core issue. Now, the funny thing is, as I eliminated neglect as a core issue, I couldn't use it as an excuse anymore. That was the sole reason I was using. Everything I did revolved around feelings of neglect. I needed to feel like I belonged. I needed to step up and show the world that I existed. And I did that through using a lot of drugs, doing a lot of stupid things. And when that was eliminated, guess what? Couldn't use it as an excuse anymore. So now if I went out and used, it would be for something completely different, which I think is kind of pitiful and sad. But once it's eliminated and once it's gone, okay, it doesn't mean that it's all rainbows and lilies. Oh, heavens no, because as soon as I eliminated that neglect, guess what happened? Whoop, another one slipped in, another core issue. And I had to do that same process to eliminate that core issue. And as soon as I eliminated that one, guess what happened? Whoop, another one slipped in. To the point where now when I have a core issue or something slip in, I can deal with it so quickly because I know the process and I've been using it for 20 plus years now that I don't linger with it. But this is a hard process. And so achieving that is almost as difficult as trying to identify it. And for you listeners, if you ever want to schedule an appointment with me to kind of jump into this, please do, because I love going through this and bringing the awareness on what this looks like so you don't have to carry it anymore. But I discovered a secret, you guys. I discovered a secret that is so important that I think I need to share with you. So I'm glad you're listening to this podcast. The mental combat secret. And that's the most important thing that you're going to be able to do and use for your addiction recovery, is being able to use your mind as what it's designed for. And that's to help you problem solve conflict, to help you resolve conflict. And why it's so important, because you know that life is full of conflict, whether you realize or not. I think you realize or maybe know that it is. We're surrounded by people in similar situations that we're in, and they all want to reach those same goals as we do. They want to have good paying jobs. They want to have nice houses. They want to have good health. They want to keep their families and their friends safe. They want just those basic pleasures, right? And as we continue to see addiction explode to dangerous levels, it's no surprise that we find ourselves maybe fighting to succeed, maybe fighting for what we believe in. And this is real true as we do metaphorically use these kind of concepts and principles on Team Addict to Athlete with sports, where it's measured by how much conflict you're willing to put yourself through, right? You're running a race, there's going to be some conflict there. But how to manage your conflict as you're going through this process of identifying your addiction, your core issues, things of that nature, is the key to real success. And I want you to really take a deep dive into this and listen closely. Because in nature, an animal typically has two responses. You know this. It's the fight or the flight, right? And so it's kind of an interesting thing. You throw a animal in the middle of a big lake, big, huge, cold lake. Guess what it's going to do? It's going to start swimming. No matter what. You throw a dog in the middle of the ocean, guess what it's going to do? It's going to start swimming. And it's going to keep swimming and keep swimming and keep swimming until either it drowns or it finds land. You do that with a human, guess what happens? Self-doubt. Okay? We doubt ourselves. We don't have that same perseverance that a lot of these animals have. The animals sometimes don't even believe or realize that they really can, I think, give up. They just react to that. So they have two typical responses, fight or flight. But as humans, we are a lot more unique, a lot more complex in our thoughts, and sometimes that actually works against us. And so we've developed this incredible intelligence and this need to kind of, I think, like split the atom and examine the human gene code and build this worldwide communication network. And all of this is at the expense of the primal, powerful instincts of mental strength that our ancestors possessed, which was going out and exploring, going out and doing these things, putting yourself into conflict and getting out of it. It is why we have these amazing races. It's why we have marathons and these mud races and these Spartan races. It's the funniest thing. We do this stuff now to challenge ourselves because we don't do it on a natural occurring cycle now. We have to pay for these things now. I love it. We have an athlete and she just went out and did another Spartan race. And I love it so much because the Spartan race is one of the toughest things you can do. But it's funny because back in the day, do you think that anyone would have paid to do anything like that? No, that was a typical Tuesday. But that's what we do now because of the way that we've evolved. Thousands of years ago, listeners, early humans would face death and violence and threats pretty much at every turn. And it was a very short and dangerous life. We know this, right? It bred kind of this intrinsic ability to focus on the now and get the job done so you could go on living. Times are changed, right? Because if you think about it, today conflict is a lot more watered down into some different forms that the mind has to adapt to. Consider the nerves before a sporting competition, maybe before a race. That pressure before you take off is kind of intense. I love the butterflies. We overthink all this stuff. Sometimes we think it's it's more like, can I do this? Am I going to be able to do this? Instead of it seems like life or death. And ironically, it kind of is in our brains, but our brains are kind of working overtime to filter out all the noise around us. Because of that, we've lost touch with the mindfulness that that situation, those opportunities give us. We forget how much power we can draw from that. So if you think about it, getting yourself into a mindset of mental combat is kind of centered on an idea of managing each conflict you're going to face and overcoming those challenges through the strength of your mind, the building up of and the character of building that strength in your recovery to promote healing and bringing that inner fighter, that core warrior within you, that agent of recovery, that champion that's within forward. And it's kind of a hard thing because we're not used to it. I think that that this is an interesting concept because it doesn't really involve like aggressiveness or anger. It really does kind of take more into account intelligence and techniques that are based on some sports psychology that I've learned along the way, some recreational therapy that I've learned, my own counseling and understanding how to switch on some of that inner motivation, that confidence that you all have inside. This is why I love working with addiction specifically, is because it doesn't have to just be a one size fits all. That's why I love Team Addict to Athlete. We have so many athletes that do so many like different kind of sports that this is where it's truly at. And so I love that we have Sensei KP on here because one thing I know about Sensei KP is that he uses martial arts and that fitness background to become more aware of the benefits of mental preparedness and kind of like, personal kind of achievement and being able to find that core self to become one with yourself. And so we'll get Sensei KP on our podcast here soon. But I want to teach you about preparing yourself mentally and recognizing the conflict in life and embracing the fact that's all around us, which is, it's going to be up to you. You've heard me say it a million times, the troops aren't coming, you are the troops. So using the best tools that I can give you to strengthen your mind and in turn your body, getting mentally focused is not just going to help you in sports, it's going to help you in life. And the concept is going to be super useful in overcoming any struggle, any stressful scenario that you're going to encounter, whether it be a potential relapse or whatnot. Because again, I want to shift you from a recovery mindset to a healing mindset. And for some of you, this is going to be like blasphemy. It's going to be like like establishment. But that's okay, because some of you who have already participated with Team Addict to Athlete, as an athlete, as a competitor, you may find that some of that benefit was from that change of lifestyle, from that change of mindset. And to be able to use simple tricks and techniques and to have these impressions to overcome your addiction, to overcome your trauma, whatever obstacle you have in front of you, to improve your confidence, to overcome stressful situations, to unlock the power of your mind and let that champion within come forward. And with that in mind, we got to start somewhere. So where do you begin, right? That core issues kind of stuff? Well, we begin by improving the mental ability that you've always had that you just haven't been able to access, or maybe you have neglected to access. And then I'm going to encourage you to approach it in whatever way is going to be most comfortable for you. So as we go through some of these principles, not just in this podcast, but more, and again, I highly recommend that if you're enjoying this podcast we have today, jump on and become a Patreon subscriber. Your extracurricular recovery program and project is all of these. We're dumping 1 to 2 to 3 times a week these principles. You can truly use for $2 a month just to get those. That can be your recovery program. But check it out. Once we are able to kind of identify that process, okay, and again, it's you using some of these techniques to self-identify your core issue and whatnot. And I'll help you if you guys want. You can reach out to me. We can get into some of the most powerful, concepts to your overall mental strength and to the increase of it, and being able to utilize some steps that are going to help you overcome any conflict that you might have. And the steps are super simple. There's only 4 of them, so write this down. The first one is you've got to recognize the conflict, okay? The second one is you got to manage the conflict by being present. The third step is you've got to analyze your opponent or the situation. And then 4, you've got to react, okay? Now, it's kind of interesting. Let's jump into this. Recognizing the conflict. Now, the very first step is obviously going to be most important, because you've got to identify whatever situation, whatever difficult situation it is that's happening to you, whether it's a stressful situation, whether it's an out of the blue situation, whether it's something that doesn't feel good, something that you weren't anticipating, an eviction notice, a loss of job. You got to recognize what the conflict is. And it may sound obvious that you may think, well, spotting a conflict is super easy for me, but really, it's not always so straightforward. Sometimes it's just a feeling. Sometimes it's just a thought. Sometimes it's just a deep down kind of in your gut kind of thing. But because of the stresses of daily life, you're kind of overwhelmed by a lot of the natural instincts that you find yourself using and not being able to recognize maybe the exact stressor that's affecting your mind and your body, and you may kind of get blindsided with it. So to avoid charging into a situation and reacting purely on emotion, you need to take a step back and recognize what's happening. That second step, managing, Katie. Managing the conflict is all about how you process the event unfolding before you, and then really being able to navigate and kind of monitor your reactions to them without jumping ship, without getting scared. It's essential that you do not allow yourself to get swallowed up by the stress of the environment or the situation and lose control of your emotions and your rational thinking. Sometimes managing is where we start trying to look for ways to get out of it, and that typically ends up in using. So if you recognize a conflict and you manage the conflict, that doesn't mean that you're avoiding it by using. It means that you're going to exercise, the things that you've already learned to calm your body, to calm your mind, and to give you an edge over the situation. And managing it means maybe you've got to bring some people on your team. Maybe it's you need to let go of some other stuff that you're doing to focus on a problem. Maybe it's really, again, surrendering yourself and asking for help. Because when you analyze that step 3, when you analyze your opponent or the situation, you start realizing that once your body and your mind are beginning to be calm and you've got more control over that, you can take stock of the situation with a clear head. That brain's decision-making process is vastly improved by going through the first steps of how you're going to approach it, rather than trying to see the end of the conflict. And when you use that analytical mind to kind of assess your opponent and calculate their weaknesses and calculate your strengths, you're going to be able to decide your course of action in a much, much more excellent way. You're going to be able to see it from a few different angles. And if you bring people on to help you manage that conflict too, you're going to have a couple set of eyes and a couple brains helping you process it. Because even in cases where, there isn't a direct opponent or direct issue, it's just, maybe something that's kind of blindsided you, it's important to understand and analyze the situation and work with and beside people that are going to help you overcome it. Because you get to that final step, which is your reaction, okay? To act and not react, and then you choose to make your move in a very controlled and calculated way. Think about it. Even during this final stage, you kind of consistently try to get back to your old process, and maybe it's trying to avoid it, maybe trying to suppress it, but really you've come too far now. You have to be able to act on it. And so the best techniques for managing conflict is being able to utilize and act in a manner that's going to help you come out on top. If you avoid it, it's going to get worse, right? So you ensure this by recognizing what is happening, by managing the stress or conflict, and then analyzing the best reaction before you move forward. And if you need help, you need to reach out. So even the best techniques for managing conflict, especially when you're doing this for the first time out of the gate, it's going to be difficult. But stress is typically the result of all of these things. And guess what the number one cause of relapse is? I'll give you a second. Yep, you're right. It's stress. So it's important to understand how much you're going to be able to take on your own and how much you've got to let other people in. So athletes, listeners, there's not a lot to this. And what I mean by that is it seems super complex, but it's not as hard as you think. The thing about what I like to teach my athletes and my people that I work with in recovery is that you're not as mysterious as you think you are. And the unfortunate part too, and I don't want this to hurt your feelings, but you're also not as unique as you think you are. Everyone struggles with something. Everyone hurts the same. Now, the people, the situations, the circumstances of that pain, it's going to be different. But the theme, that golden thread, is going to be exactly the same. So that tells me that we, by not allowing other people in, think that we have an exclusive right or deal that no one else has an understanding or an inkling of compassion for. That's not true. We all have aspects of things that we've had work for us or against us. Why not pick from the people that you know can help you? The construct in your mind and the way that you approach this stuff is so crucial. I love to work with people on such a different level because I want you not only to understand the principles behind finding your core issue so you can eliminate it, to heal from your addiction, but also to understand that there are so many other attributes that have been working against you because of some old style thinking, right? That once an addict, always an addict mentality is false and completely untrue. Yet if you do not apply some of this knowledge that you're now getting and you're now receiving into your own recovery, and you keep using it as an excuse to use, then I'll tell you the same thing that I said last night on the Agents of Recovery podcast with Max and Brock, and that is, then go out and be the best addict you can be. Because this is not easy, and it's super difficult, and it's super challenging, and it may not be for you. Maybe you don't want this. I know too many people that we've tried to help along the way that keep going back to it. No matter how much you invest, no matter how much you give, they for some reason do not believe in themselves that they're good enough or that they should deserve to be clean and sober. And so what happens? They continually go out there and use. They have bouts of treatment. They spend thousands of dollars of time, of energy, of love, of money, of compassion from people, and they continue to sink their ship. It's because they're afraid to get into the core issue stuff. They think automatically that if I solve these issues, then I'll have no excuse to use, and I'm terrified of that. So the old concept may be true, but I want you guys to listen to this very closely. Is it truly a mind over matter situation? Or is it a mind over matter over mind situation? It's super easy to think that your mind and your body as two separate parts of who you are. In reality, they are the mere fibers intertwined and meshed up together. They're one and the same. Most people are familiar with that concept, mind over matter, but athletes, very few recognize matter over mind, and it's just as equally valid as the other. So what does it mean? Well, listen closely. Simply put, the body and mind are in a constant cycle. They fuel each other, and they can either help or hinder your performance. It's all about being open to new experiences, new sets of assistance, maybe allowing yourself to not be so closed-minded when it comes to new information, not being afraid that maybe the old ways you've learned aren't the only ways you can learn. There's some mind hacks that we can use. There's a lot of different things you can do, but what I've noticed is that we're doing this to build relationships. It's the only reason you found yourself listening to Team Addict to Athletes podcast. It's the only reason you found yourself wanting to even jump into addiction recovery and healing from the trauma and healing from these things is because you truly want to reestablish and rebuild stronger relationships. So being able to recognize and manage your conflict through identifying your core issue to heal from addiction is not going to be easy, but it's certainly not impossible. And it's possible when you align yourself with the right people to help you do so. Being able to recognize the stressors in your life is so important because, as you know, not all stress is bad. Think about it. There's some good stress too when you're going on a vacation, when you're doing something fun. There's good stress, but your body can't tell. It's interesting. A raised pulse is often experienced in both negative and positive stress. And it can definitely help you escape a bad situation by becoming physically stronger, maybe more resistant to fatigue. But after a while, that stress will start to consume you. And so what does it point out? Well, it points out the fact that a lot of these things that we have had happen to us, they are natural responses to the way that we've learned to handle our trauma and handle our problems and to handle the pain, like I talked about, that created your addiction. So we need to teach you how to train your brain to handle the adrenaline, obviously, because, if you get put in a situation where you're triggered, you're going to have that. We have to be able to understand the truth behind the panic versus like action so that you don't panic and do something as a reaction instead of an action, which is a more mindful kind of aspect of approaching it. Then how to deal with those kind of panic attacks. We're going to get into those things in the future, but athletes, I want to just give you that little bit of info on maybe some extending resources, because as I went through the dual diagnosis stuff last week, a few people reached out and said, but why? But where's this come from? And I hope that you've been able to be edified, maybe strengthened a little bit about my own thoughts. These are my views and my views only. I know that they work because I've seen great success with it. I don't think by labeling ourselves as addicts is going to help us, create a really strong and productive future. If you want to, that's your choice. I don't mind at all. I don't turn my nose at you. If you feel like that's your path, then use it. Me personally, I'm going to teach a few other ways. It doesn't mean I'm right, doesn't mean I'm wrong. It just means that there's another way to get there. And I'm excited to continue to share this stuff with you. I love having guests on here, and we've got a few podcasts that are coming out with guests and stuff, but every once in a while, I like to get back doing some teaching to help you guys understand maybe some of the philosophy of the team, maybe kind of the stuff that I am teaching so you can be aware of it, so you're not like getting blindsided by like, hey, what is this? It's just a different approach that I've seen that's a little bit untraditional, a little bit off the beaten path, and it's something that is 100% out of my brain. And so it doesn't have a ton of research backing, but maybe if there's someone listening that wants to help me create a study project, I'd love to talk with you. But I want to thank Radio Ronin and the Radio Ronin Network for all they do for Team Addict to Athlete. Sensei KP, his podcast is on Radio Ronin as well. But you've got the New Day podcast. You've got Greg's Guide to New Music, which I highly recommend. Greg Pascal, he's an amazing guy. He's just joined the Ronin team with Josh and Chandler and Chunga. Guys, go listen to their podcasts. These podcasts, after you listen to some of these, they're inspiring, but sometimes they leave you with a little bit of like, maybe I don't want to say this out loud, but maybe a little bit of like, challenge, melancholy, maybe some feelings, go listen to Radio Ronin with Josh, Chandler, Panda, which is Greg, and Chunga and Chandler, and go listen to their podcast because they'll make you laugh. They're fun. Greg's Guide to New Music. I've listened to his podcast for so long now. He's got great stuff there. And again, you can go out there and find all kinds of stuff on the Radio Ronin network. And athletes, keep reaching out. Please do so. Join the Patreon, patreon.com/addict2athlete. That's a TO athlete. It helps us move that podcast forward, and it gives you something in return. I love that you can donate, but I love being able to give you something in return. And it's high quality content. Like I said, our extracurricular recovery playbook's there for you. You can truly use it as a pathway to your own recovery. And until next time, please, athletes, go turn that mess into a message. Listeners, thank you so much for downloading and subscribing to Team Addict to Athletes podcast. Also, please join Addict to Athletes' sister podcast, The Agents of Recovery, that can be found on all podcasting platforms. As we approach now the Christmas season, I would love to turn your attention to our fundraising efforts on Team Addict to Athlete as we continue our efforts in our Project ELF. This is our Sub for Santa experience that we do every year, having had great success in the past, being able to assist hundreds of families and children over the past 10 years of operation. We are in need of your donations to assist us in bringing Christmas to those children who may have lost a parent or a loved one to addiction, but also those who have found themselves on hard times due to addiction, due to situations that mental health has taken away from the family system. You can donate through our pages, addicttoathlete.org, to our Venmo. Please reach out if you'd like direct contact, but any and all donations will go directly to help our Project ELF, which is Addict to Athlete Sub for Santa mission. As a 501c3, these are tax deductible, but we totally appreciate your willingness to assist us in providing even a small amount of love and compassion during a very intense holiday that could be the first without a primary caregiver because of this epidemic, such as overdose or incarceration. I want to thank you, the listeners, once more for all that you do with Team Addict to Athlete. Please share and subscribe and get behind this podcast, as we truly appreciate all that you do. And please think about joining Team Addict to Athlete's effort through Project ELF.